Welcome to the class video for Module 2, the first of two modules devoted to John Locke's The Second Treatise of Government. In this class, we're going to look at John Locke's historical context, look at some of the major trends of 17th century England that he's responding to. In this class, we're going to be less interested in the personal biographies of the writers, sort of their personalities and backgrounds, but more interested in the documents they produce describing the world that they live in and the particular historical events that are going on. So we'll take a look at just a few of the major themes of 17th century England that Locke's work is expressing. And then we'll turn to the text and we'll try to tackle the first of what are really three major phases or acts of the second treatise, or sort of components of Locke's philosophy, the state of nature. Your assignments for Module 2 are to read Locke chapters 1 through 7, which is actually in the version we have 1 through 5 and 7, because I did not assign you 6. Take the first Locke reading quiz, and as always, as you're doing your reading and following along with class, look for passages or discussion points that you think are relevant to the constitutional clause that you want to write on for your concept essay and then textual genealogy. If you will kind of build an outline as you go through your weeks of reading, you'll really have a much smaller task when the assignments come due in the writing weeks. All right, John Locke is an Englishman whose major works are from the 1680s and the 1690s, or roughly the last quarter of the 17th century. And the place to begin sort of situating him in the Western philosophical canon is hopefully the place where you left off in Foundations of the American Experience. Again, depending on your instructor, and how they presented the material to you, you should have had at least a small sampling out of the Small White Matthews collection, The Philosophy of Science. Indeed, I think it's pretty common for LTU instructors to approach that class, Foundations, as a body of literature culminating in the literature of the scientific revolution. We are teaching philosophy for engineers and architects and applied scientists of all stripes, and so it is a kind of logical and conventional approach to think about that class presenting the classical foundations of the ancient writings that provide the foundations of the modern scientific method. And if that's your point of view about that class, then the whole semester is building up to spending time in the readings of Copernicus and Bacon, Galileo, Descartes, Newton, and there may be a couple others in that collection. Now, even if you did not take Foundations, or if you had an instructor with a different focus, hopefully you have a general sense or a kind of vague sense that there was a transformation in Western culture as we emerged out of called the Dark Ages or medievalism into the modern world, that Western culture went through a transformation in its understanding of the material world and how to understand the physical world that we live in. You may have a sense that in the pre-modern world, that Westerners, it was common to believe that the universe revolved around the Earth, that the Earth was the center of the universe, and that this character Copernicus came along and demonstrated, debated with the Catholic Church, was persecuted by the Catholic Church for attempting to prove that in fact the Earth is a planet that revolves around the sun. We call that a heliocentric model of the universe. And indeed, Copernicus was generations ahead of his time, and it would really take Bacon and Galileo half a century later to sort of demonstrate that and for that model to become common currency among European intellectuals. And you may have again, a general sense or a vague sense connected to that as Western culture came to have a more kind of accurate conception of the larger universe, that was the birth of the origins of modern physics, the Newtonian revolution, at the core of which conceptually is the idea that all objects everywhere at all times are in motion, and that it's the tension, the resistance, and the force created by objects in motion that hold us in relation to each other. Nothing is stable, nothing is static. The attraction and repulsions that we feel are all born out of motion itself. And further, that motion can be mathematically described. If you are a health science major, you may have a sense that in the scientific revolution lie the origins of your own field, that it was just in this time period that Gassendi and Boyle and Huygens were defying church doctrine, starting to dissect human bodies and understand our interior systems. And that closely related to that, not only human bodies, but other species, and closely related to that then is the idea that species are historically connected. We're not quite to the theory of Darwinian evolution, of course, yet, but this idea that species change over historical time, and deep time at that, is a foundational challenge to medieval conceptions of species and man's role in the world. These foundational, sort of paradigmatic changes in the way we understand our natural selves and our place in the natural world, we call broadly the scientific revolution. John Locke was a contemporary of, and many of these figures was an associate, a correspondent with, in the second half of the 17th century. And indeed, Locke's major philosophical work, the one that, among philosophers, the one that is considered most important, not among political scientists, and the work that we're going to read, the Second Treatise of Government, was called An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, which is primarily focused on the field of epistemology. That may be a term, epistemology may be a term that's familiar to you again, depending on your instructor for foundations, or it may be a strange word. Epistemology is a field of philosophy which attempts to evaluate the basis for knowledge. Episte is the Greek root knowing. So epistemologists try to investigate how do we as human beings, with kind of the equipment that we're given, right, with our bodies, our senses, and our minds, how do we come to understand the world? How can we interact and get data and feedback from the world and interpret that data? And especially epistemology is concerned with how can we be certain about the knowledge that we interpret from our interaction from the world. What is knowing? If you remember Plato's Republic, what is the difference between knowing and believing? So the sort of shorthand bumper sticker for the field of epistemology is, how do you know what you think you know, right? How can you be certain? What are the true standards of knowledge? So Locke's major work is concerned with that field, and he is revolutionary or unique, or his particular contribution is to describe human beings. The phrase he uses is tabula rasa, or a blank slate. And Locke's notion is we're born into the world essentially as a blank slate. Then we interact with the world, both with our bodies and our minds. Those experiences and those impressions then form the basis on which we can use our reason to understand the world. So our sensory experience, our physical experience is primary. That's the thing that we can be certain of. And then from that, we can make reasoned deductions about the world. Now that's radically different. If you read in the Matthews collection Descartes' Discourse on Method, the famous line cogito ergo sum, right? I think, therefore I am. Or if you read Plato's Republic and you think about the world of the forms. So the opposite of this kind of materialist sensory epistemology is what's known as idealism or rationalism. So if you take Plato as an example, Plato thinks that there is a world of perfect forms of things. What we see in the real world are merely imperfect approximations of the perfect idea of the thing. So you have an object in front of you, it looks like a desk. You can imagine 4 or 5 different objects that you all might think, well, that's kind of a desk. Plato's answer would be each one of those things is a desk to the extent that it approximates the perfect desk that lives in the world of the forms. So that idea that reason is primary, or that perspective, that reason is primary, that the concept of a thing is the primary reality, and then our physical interaction with physical things in the real world is secondary. It's merely an approximation of the perfection of the concept. That's the idea that Locke is arguing against. And another example, again, depending on your instructor for foundations, if you read Hobbes's Leviathan, and we'll come back to that here in a couple of slides, the first half of Hobbes's Leviathan, Volume 1, describes a materialist epistemology, where we're just physical bodies and we're interacting with physical things in the world, and from that we interpret or reason based on our experience. So John Locke's primary philosophical work, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, engages those issues, and as much as anything else, Locke's biography is defined by this work laying the foundations for 19th century empiricism. So that's Locke's primary identity is sort of as a philosopher of the late 17th century and a contemporary of all these other great scientific theorists. We'll see that reflected in the Second Treatise of Government with Locke's emphasis on human reason. And hopefully you've already seen that in the chapters on the state of nature. Not only that we have reason, but the particular kind of reason that Locke describes us as having, a kind of reason of universal accessibility, that the foundational concept of reason is 1 + 1 = 2. It is just objectively true, and you can't deny it and be a complete human being or fully functioning human being. That reason, or the truth of that reason statement, is, in Jefferson's famous phrase, self-evident to us. We'll see that throughout his work, that theory of reason gets him in trouble, because it may be the case that humans aren't innately rational, and his wrestling with that subject, or wrestling with that conceptual problem, forms a persistent theme through his work, and we'll see it emerge when we get to the American writings. The next dimension of Locke's historical context that we'll want to consider, and one that will bring us closer to the main theme of this course, is his role in the growth of the British Empire. At the time that Locke is writing, in the 1680s and the 1690s, Britain is a solid century into its project of building its overseas empire. You may recall the lost colony of Roanoke in 1581, which is their first failed attempt to create a permanent settlement in the New World. Their first permanent and lasting settlement in the New World comes in 1607 with the founding of Jamestown, Virginia. So by the time Locke is writing, the Brits have been at the project of collecting colonies for a good 70 to 100 years, and it becomes a particular political issue in Locke's generation. There's a dramatic acceleration of Britain's efforts to create overseas colonies in the aftermath of the English Civil War. And as we'll see in a few weeks when we get to Dickinson and Tom Paine, the disputes, the political disputes over control between the colonies and Parliament in Britain are really focused and coming to a head for the first time just in the period of Locke's writings. They'll sort of explode again in the 1760s and the 1770s, which will lead to the American Revolution. But the first period of dramatic political give and take and conflict between the colonies and Britain is just happening in the 1670s and the 1680s for reasons we'll talk about in the next slide. But we can think just broadly or generally about some of the foundational concepts that you've already encountered in the second treatise and see how transparently they are an attempt by Western philosophy to explain to Western culture, to come up with a rationalization about what the experience of European engagement with New World cultures is. And so, one of the most important recurring concepts, not just in Locke's work, but in all of the social contract theorists, is this idea of a state of nature, a time or place where men exist outside of the laws of civilization. It recurs in, if you read Hobbes in Foundations, you saw the state of nature there. You've seen it if you've begun your Locke reading. In the very early chapters of Locke, you'll see it again in Rousseau, in Paine. It is one of the most common conceptual foundations of political theory that marks off 18th century Enlightenment thinking from virtually every other phase. Well, in the state of nature, Locke is very transparently describing Native American peoples, what the Europeans found when they discovered this essentially half of the globe that they didn't know existed, and they discovered peoples living there who are clearly living in communities, but not with any system of law or government that the Europeans at least could recognize as being law and government. And so it's not a coincidence that just a century or so after the Europeans have had their first contacts with native peoples, that its philosophy starts to describe this original state, this pre-civilized state that Locke's going to describe as the state of nature. Two other concepts that are foundational for Locke and that you've already encountered in the reading are also transparently trying to describe changes in legal and political culture as Britain tries to adapt to its imperial project. One of the most distinguishing features of Locke's second treatise are the chapters on property and his description of the natural law of property. How Europeans can come to own land that is ostensibly in the possession of these Native American peoples, right, is a great conceptual problem for European thinkers. How is it that they are not simply stealing the land from the natives? When Locke is describing this doctrine of first possessor, that man has a natural right to take title to land found in nature, not possessed by anybody else, it's clearly a kind of metaphor for describing Europeans coming and taking ownership of Native Americans' land, and he is transcribing a principle that has a long history in the British common law, this idea that of the first possessor, and we'll get a chance to talk more about that. A second foundational concept for Locke that is also clearly implicated in the imperial project is the idea of contract. For Locke, the social contract, and if you stopped at chapter 7 for this module and didn't go any further, we're going to hear a lot more about the rights and obligations of contract when we get into the second half of Locke. But there's a transformation in the legal foundation of the European economy that's brought about by the building of empires. Essential to the idea of empire is this distance factor, right? Two different communities of people that are tied by the same legal system, right? So the colonies and Britain are supposed to both observe the same legal principles, and what binds the colonies and the imperial center together is the exchange of property, right? What codifies and renders obligatory that exchange of property is the idea of contract. The kind of sacred obligation imposed by your contract is really not a medieval idea. The Middle Ages would be much more, the legal system of a pre-modern world, of a pre-capitalist world, would be much more concerned with preserving community stability, preserving traditions and customs, even if it meant that a contract had to be broken. The breaking of the contract is a kind of second order or third order principle that, sure, contracts are important, but you can just legally justify breaking them for all kinds of reasons in a pre-modern world. In a economy that's structured around the exchange of property between colonial periphery and imperial center, that obligatory nature of your agreement of what belongs to whom and following through on your agreement is absolutely foundational to the whole system working. So again, it's not surprising as the Europeans sort of are entering their maturity, or say their adolescence of their imperial project, they're coming to understand that their philosophical or legal rationales for who owns what and what obligations adhere in what agreements, that their sort of medieval conceptions of those things are just now working for the modern economy that they're trying to build. What Locke is doing, or is a part of, is a generation of legal and philosophical thinkers trying to come up with a different paradigm for explaining the obligations of contract, the rights of property, civilization in pre-civilized states, etc. So in all these ways, Locke is articulating Britain and more broadly Europe's cultural adaptation to the discovery of what they would call the New World. Right? At the foundation of that is they're building a new economy that's really going to take them to the 20th century. The growth of empire is going to be the major sort of global economic trend all through the 17, 18, and 1900s, and then it's going to kind of blow up on us with the two world wars in the first half of the 20th century. Locke is a witness to and a describer of these foundational changes in Western culture. The primary and immediate historical context in which to understand Locke's second treatise of government is the British Glorious Revolution of 1688, in which the British Parliament overthrew the British king and replaced him with another king. John Locke was a member of Parliament and a leader of the parliamentary faction that was advocating for overthrowing the king. Indeed, he writes the Second Treatise of Government while in exile or in hiding in Amsterdam with other leaders of Parliament, fearful of arrest by the king's soldiers. More than anything else, the Second Treatise of Government is Locke's justification or rationalization for Parliament's authority to overthrow the king. The Glorious Revolution is a seminal event in the 1200-year history of the British Constitution, and more than any other single event, lays the foundation for the modern British Constitution that we see in operation today, in which Parliament, and especially the House of Commons, is the primary sovereign authority, and the other elements of the Constitution, particularly the monarchy, but also the House of Lords, the other component of Parliament, are really adjunct to or peripheral to the primary authority of the House of Commons. That basic arrangement of branches, if you want to call them that, was really laid in 1688 and its immediate aftermath. Now, the Glorious Revolution is the culmination of nearly a century, about 3/4 of a century, of intense political and constitutional crisis in England. It really begins with the ascension of the first Stuart king, James I, in 1603. The last Tudor monarch, Elizabeth, died in 1601 with no heirs. You may know that she was called the Virgin Queen because she never got married and never had children. And so in 1601, when Elizabeth dies, The British Parliament finds itself in a very unusual situation for 17th century Europe. There is no great contest or claimants, contest among claimants to the throne. There is no war about to break out among different children of the monarch who just passed. Parliament essentially has the ability to choose or to invite someone to come and take up the throne. James the First in 1601 is James the Sixth of Scotland, and the Stuart family have been monarchs in Scotland going back centuries. So when Parliament invites James the Sixth of Scotland to come take over the British throne, the English throne, that's known as the Union of the Crowns, and that's the moment at which the Scottish crown and the English crown are joined together to form the British crown. And the next major component of that, the Irish crown, will be added about a century later, I think 1704. And you have the essential components of what is Britain, England, Scotland, and Ireland formed over the course of the 17th century. The first phase of the Stuart ascension was not particularly controversial for at least, or conflictual for at least two reasons. As King of Scotland, James was accustomed to dealing with powerful noblemen. On the scale of European monarchies, the Scottish monarch was not a particularly powerful figure. He was always had been dependent on the lords and the great wealthy landowners of his realm and had relatively weak political power. So when James VI becomes James I of Britain, he doesn't make particularly extraordinary claims for his own authority. On the other side, Parliament had been greatly emboldened and empowered over the course of the 16th century under the Tudor kings, um, transformed from what Parliament had been in the medieval period, largely as a product of the Protestant Reformation. You may know the story of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, his first wife, and seeking the divorce and the Pope denying it, launching the Protestant Reformation in Britain. The outcome is that England will become the most radically Protestant country of Europe, the most anti-Catholic country in Europe, and for the century that follows, the wars of religion, England will be the great Protestant military power in Europe. Key to Henry's success was to kicking the Catholic Church out of England and asserting his control over the Church of England was taking those church lands that he seized from the Catholic Church when he evicted them and creating a whole new cohort of nobility, a whole new class of dukes and earls and lords and whatnot, by divvying up the Catholic lands. Well, those newly made noblemen then found their way into Parliament, and Henry was really, and the successive Tudor monarchs were really dependent on that partnership with Parliament in order to fight the wars of religion and to resist Catholic power. So when the last Tudor monarch dies, Elizabeth, she leaves behind a parliament that is greatly emboldened, greatly empowered vis-a-vis its monarch compared to virtually any other comparable institution in Europe at the time. So the initial phase of the 17th century of the Stuart ascension under James I was not particularly conflictual, because you have essentially a weak king who is used to being weak and a powerful parliament that is used to being powerful, and there's not a lot of conflict in that situation. It is with James's son, Charles I, who comes to the throne in 1625, where the conflict really begins. That's going to culminate in a war, in a civil war. Charles is surrounded by advisors, and we'll talk about this more when we get to Rousseau's historical context. There is a developing idea in European politics that focuses on the monarch as the center of gravity for the political system of the nation, that the monarch is the repository of all sovereignty, of all power in the realm. Anyone who could have any authority in the realm must ultimately derive that authority from the monarch. And we'll talk about this in the Rousseau modules as the rising theory of the absolute power of kings, or benevolent despotism is a more less pejorative phrase or way of thinking about it. We'll come to that when we get to Rousseau. Charles is greatly inflated with these notions of his own absolute authority, and he starts asserting himself in a whole number of ways against Parliament, particularly around issues of taxation, around making appointments, judicial appointments, and church appointments, and as we'll see in greater detail in the mid part of the course, in asserting power over the colonies. Particularly in the 1630s then and the early 1640s, there are a whole sequence of controversies, political disputes between the king and parliament in Britain that are ultimately going to culminate in a civil war that breaks out in its first early phase in 1642. It's a kind of on-again, off-again affair until the end of 1645, beginning of 1646, when it breaks out into all-out war. In 1648, Charles will be captured on the battlefield. He will be hauled back to the Tower of London and imprisoned. And in 1649, Parliament will put Charles on trial, declare him a heretic and a tyrant, an enemy of the people of Britain, and they will execute Charles I in 1649. This is an extraordinary and almost singular moment in modern European political history. Kings die. That is not an uncommon affair. They die of causes other than natural causes. They get poisoned by their nephews and stabbed in the back by their cousins. It is a truly extraordinary and singular event in European political history to have a legislature proclaim of itself as the representative of the sovereign authority of the nation, that they have the power to put a king on trial and to determine the guilt or innocence of a monarch. This is almost without precedent. At least you have to go back to the classical period, to the pre-Christian period, to find analogs to this event. But Parliament does it. They execute the king, and for the next roughly 10 years, Parliament rules without a king in what's known as the Commonwealth period or the interregnum. And interregnum is simply Latin for between kings. Right? So during the Commonwealth period, what's important to understand is that Parliament is not really advocating a democracy. They claim their authority as representatives of something called the people, but it's not a political system that is designed to allow the people to exercise their will. There are all kinds of religious overtones to the English Civil War, and more than anything else, the parliamentary forces, the Roundheads, are going to impose a kind of theocracy, a kind of religious law upon the people of Britain. The people of Britain are pretty miserable under that experience. It's not a popular government, and it's really driven by a kind of cult of personality around Oliver Cromwell, who had been the great general of the parliamentary forces during the war, and then ruled in what he called himself the Lord Protector of the people, as a kind of prime minister of parliament. Right? He claimed just to be a member of parliament, but the leader of parliament, and directed the authority of parliament through his personal will. When Cromwell dies in 1659, the whole thing kind of crumbles apart, and people look to Cromwell's son to be the kind of heir apparent, which of course smacks of hereditary succession and monarchy. And the bottom line is Cromwell's son simply doesn't have the kind of will and drive for dominance that his dad had, and really has no interest in being the next Lord Protector. Parliament enters into negotiations then with the son of Charles I, who is living in exile in France and sort of shaking his fist and yelling at Parliament, "You stole my throne." The leaders of Parliament then enter into negotiations with the son of Charles, who will come back to the throne, take up the Stuart monarchy again in 1660 in what's known as the Restoration, and he'll take the title Charles II. Uh, he'll rule again. We'll come back to this in a couple of modules when we talk about the origins of the colonial crisis and the American Revolution. It's really rooted in the laws that Charles passed in his reign in this 25 years governing the colonies. The essential laws that the Americans are going to be protesting have their origins in this time period, but it is when his brother comes to the throne, James II, in 1685, that Parliament decides that it's the moment to free themselves of this hated family. And in particular, the issue again with James II is his overt Catholicism. He openly practices Catholicism. He has a Catholic girlfriend and the secret wife. They're secretly married in a Catholic ceremony. And then in 1687, they have a child, a son, and so now there's a Catholic heir to the British throne. That then becomes the pretext for Locke and other leaders of Parliament to proclaim that the Stuarts are not an acceptable family to rule Britain, that they are so at odds with the people of Britain and the culture of Britain that it is Parliament's responsibility to remove the Stuart monarchs and to bring in a different family. That will happen finally in 1688 in what ultimately is a kind of bloodless revolution when James becomes aware of the leaders of Parliament plotting against him. James tries to raise an army, and he can't find enough people to fight for him that it becomes essentially hopeless, and he realizes that he has no forces to match the armies that Parliament is able to raise. He initially flees to Ireland, where he tries to raise an army again, and you may know something about British culture. If you can't excite the Irish to come fight with you to go kill Englishmen, you know you're really unpopular as a king. And ultimately, James II is going to flee to France, and he will live out his life. And for generations, descendants of the Stuart lines will be living kind of off the generosity of the French kings, shaking their fist at the British Parliament, saying that they had their throne stolen from them in what's known as the Stuart pretense. That will last well into the 19th century. The outcome of the Glorious Revolution and James fleeing the country is not what the Americans will do a century later. The British do not have a kind of constitutional convention where they sit down and they all say, okay, let's write up a constitution. You may know that the British Constitution has never been written down. It is an unwritten constitution, and we'll have reasons to think about that further along in the course. Rather, what happens is, first of all, Parliament invites William of Orange, and he's not related to any British royalty, but his wife, Mary, is, and so they invite William and Mary to come for a short tenure, and ultimately it'll pass to Queen Anne, and then finally we'll get the first George in, I believe, 1701, and that'll be the beginning of the Hanover line. We'll get the sequence of Georges that will take us right up to the American Revolution. So the first thing is there's no great constitutional convention or no great seminal moment in which they sit down and come to an agreement. Rather, they invite in a new monarch, and then Parliament over the next about 10 to 15 years passes a series of important pieces of legislation that are essentially like constitutional laws, and we call that collection of revisions. So there is the Bill of Liberties, which is a sort of Bill of Rights for the British people. The Septennial and the Triennial Acts declare that Parliament will have elections for Parliament at least once in every 7 years, and that Parliament shall meet at least once in every 3 years, which were all things that had been sort of custom and tradition that were at the center of dispute over the previous century, then become codified, but in this important distinction in ordinary legislation. That is to say, it is an act, the Septennial Act is an act of Parliament. What The British at the end of the 17th century don't make the distinction that the Americans are going to make a century later, which is first you sit down and write the Constitution, the fundamental laws, the higher laws, and then underneath that Constitution, you elect a legislature which enacts ordinary legislation subject to that higher law, right? So they don't have that conceptual distinction here in 1688. Rather, what we get is a period of about a decade, decade and a half, where you get a whole slew of these foundational pieces of legislation that describe what powers the judiciary has, the powers of parliament, the relative powers of the monarchy, etc. And that collection of legislation we call the Whig Constitution. Right? It is these foundational changes in the structure of the British government that are embodied in these acts of parliament for about a decade or so after 1688. That Whig Constitution is the contemporary British Constitution. Most Brits would say that their Constitution today is the Whig Constitution that comes from 1688. Finally, thinking about Locke's second treatise as a text, a philosophical rationalization or justification for this political act, it's important to set it in context with Hobbes's Leviathan. Again, if you took Foundations of the American Experience, hopefully you got at least a taste or a sample of Hobbes's Leviathan. It's a large and very complex and difficult to read text, so it really depends on your instructor and how it was folded into the syllabus for the semester. But Hobbes is the first great social contract theorist. Hobbes, a generation before Locke, worked out the theory of the state of nature and natural reason and natural law. But for Hobbes, it led him to the exact opposite conclusion of Locke. Hobbes concludes that the natural law of politics, the man's natural state outside of society or civilization, should lead man to be willing to give up all of his rights to create an absolute sovereign. Hobbes writes the Leviathan and is really the kind of prototype or the first version of social contract thinking as a justification for the Stuarts' claim to be absolute monarchs. For Hobbes, the state of nature is so terrifying, and the idea of living without laws, living without government, living without police and courts to protect us, should be so terrifying to each one of us that we should understand it is a rational bargain for us to willingly give up all of our rights in exchange for the protection that comes from government. Locke, interestingly, is going to essentially steal Hobbes's basic paradigm, his basic framework around the state of nature and the role of the social contract, but it's going to lead Locke to the exact opposite conclusion. And for Locke, social contract theory is going to be the foundation of the right of the people to rule through their elected legislature. This transition from Hobbes's application of the social contract to Locke's then are going to give us two reference points against which we can compare Rousseau. And with Rousseau's version of the social contract, we have this kind of foundational trilogy. It is conventional to think about the social contract as having three great exponents, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, and that they exist along a kind of spectrum from right to left. That is, Hobbes's employment of the social contract theory leads him to a kind of authoritarian regime, the ultimate power of one person. Rousseau's version of the social contract is going to lead him to a collectivist scheme, and Rousseau is going to put enormous emphasis on the group and very little emphasis on the individual. We'll see that in modules 4 and 5. Locke exists in this kind of uneasy middle of the spectrum between those two, which produces a lot of contradictions or tensions in Locke's formulation of the social contract, but it'll allow us to see how unique Locke is if we're able to compare him as we dive into the text to Hobbes's version of the social contract, and then we get to Rousseau to kind of triangulate between the three. Will give you a nice sense of the spectrum, the different ways in which social contract theory can be applied. All right, that's a whole lot on Locke's historical context. Let's turn now and look at the text.